not going to give this.
From Washington, D.C., this is White House Chronicle. White House Chronicle, a reverent and sometimes irreverent look at news and issues at the White House and elsewhere, with Llewellyn King, Linda Gasparello, and featured guests, is brought to you by White House Weekly and the Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. Here now is the program host, veteran correspondent Llewellyn King.
Hello and welcome to White House Chronicle. I'm very glad to have with me, as usual, Linda Gasparello of White House Weekly, and today, very special guest, Dr. Michael Frazier of Howard University. And I'd like to mention that Howard University assists us in the production. This show is produced in conjunction with the university. He is the Associate Professor of Political Science and Graduate Studies in Political Science. I get that right, or I got it backwards?
You have it correct.
Close enough.
That's
close
good
enough. The general idea and field is clearly established, right?
I work there.
Good show. And our old friend Jim Bohannon of Westwood Radio, 400 radio stations, 5 nights a week. We always like to have Jim Bohannon here because we think he is the person talking to the American public. Actually, he is probably the person talking to the slightly wacko part of the American public that calls talk shows at 1 in the morning to get something off their chest, maybe what they drunk earlier in the evening.
We're #1 in neurotics, 18 to 34. That's right.
Do you ever, you know, sort of say, those of you who have taken your medicine today, please call us?
Yes, we have a medicated line and a non-medicated line. Yeah, it works out better.
Anyway, it's lovely to have this distinguished company, and we start as usual with Linda. And Linda, what is going on at the White House? How damaged were they by last week's vote on the non-proliferation treaty?
Well, they're still talking about it, and they're still putting their own spin on it. What's happening at the White House now is what I call the Home Alone syndrome for the president.
Test ban treaty
yes,
is what
exactly.
I should have said,
right.
not the
I don't mean
NPT.
to brush that aside, but what's going on now is Home Alone. The First
Home
Lady.
Alone.
Yes, Home Alone for the president. The First Lady is off campaigning. The Vice President is off campaigning. The president is home alone. He's holding up the whole fort.
And how is he doing that? He's a man of phenomenal energy. Do we know what he is doing, and should we care?
I suppose the First Lady should care, but...
Announcing initiatives, perhaps.
Announcing initiatives, of course, yes.
I might turn...
Dealing with the Congress, dealing with that obstreperous Congress.
I might turn to Michael Frazier, who teaches at the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, as well as Howard University. The test ban treaty of last week's defeat. How do you feel about this?
I feel it's, as always, partisan politics in Washington, D.C., and that the Republican majority are not going to give this president any kind of victory given the backdrop of the upcoming election. And so to get a treaty...
Is it the upcoming election, or is it the impeachment that failed? Or both?
I think the impeachment issue is really passe in the past. In this town is whatever happens lately. And what's lately now is the money in terms of the budget, as well as this test ban treaty. And so anything to defeat a incumbent president who you don't like, for whatever reasons, you do it. And considering the majority leader chose not to have any debate on the treaty and bringing it to a vote, represents, in my judgment, partisan politics at its heights.
Jim Bohannon, what do you hear from that 400 and plus radio station audience about test ban, about politics today? I know during the impeachment, it was very active. What do we have these days?
Well, they're still quite active, and a lot of people out there, I think, feel that this is a flawed treaty, but that may simply reflect the generally conservative tenor of the audience. But there's a good deal of feeling, I think, that this treaty is not a good idea. I don't think that's reflected at the official level. It's not reflected certainly at the level of diplomats or at the level of, say, the chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but there is a lot of public feeling that this is a flawed treaty.
There are a lot of what one might call the wise old men, not to be sexist about it, who have big misgivings about one aspect of the treaty as it was negotiated, and that was no testing in perpetuity. I've spent a good deal of time crawling around the 3 big weapons labs and know a little bit about this, and all of the people I know, physicists who actually make weapons at Los Alamos, Sandia, and Lawrence Livermore, feel that it is important to test and that simulation in computers is not good enough, and that you have this deterioration of chemicals as well as the radioactive deterioration in weapons that we have in stockpile now, which have not been tested in 7 years. That's a fairly sophisticated. To me, it's the only compelling part of the argument against. Verification, I think, that we're much better at it than we've said, and the yields would be so small in the unverifiable tests that it doesn't matter. What do you think happens next?
Well, I think nothing happens. I think it's stalemate. I do not see this Congress supporting any kind of treaty unless it's a treaty that is so restrictive in many ways that the president can't sign it. And I don't see the Republican majority relinquishing any bits of ground. They feel in many ways, in my judgment, they have the president and the White House in a box. He's home alone. Let him stay there.
Isn't this, to coin a phrase, a bit explosive? Supposing there's another test in Asia before the next election, isn't this going to be very difficult for the Republicans? Aren't the Democrats then going to say, see, country X tested, and it wouldn't have happened because they had signed and we didn't ratify?
Well, Republicans would point, I think, quite correctly that any nation that is really that close to having nuclear weapons that wants to test will test anyway, as the Pakistanis did and as the Indians did. And it's fair to point out, too, I think, that it's not as though the United States has single-handedly torpedoed this treaty. It would require, I think, 44 nations that were considered nuclear capable, which is at best a rough approximation, and the total is more than a dozen away from that now. So this treaty is a long way from ever becoming any kind of a law of the world.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think had it been ratified, of course, we would then have been bound by it ourselves.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
isn't that one of the complexities of these treaties?
We are bound by treaties that we sign, theoretically, but the United States reserve the right, and they have acted unilaterally whenever it perceives its interests to be in jeopardy. So even though there's a treaty, given the history of our society, whenever there's an issue where we feel that national security is in jeopardy, or if we invent the national security issue, we respond accordingly. And there's lots of history to validate that.
And all of history is about broken treaties, isn't it?
Well, one wonders if the same thing will happen with the
Well, it was the
Kyoto.
longest-lived treaty, wasn't it, between the Portuguese and the British? Mm-hmm. I think that went on for decades, but very few treaties survive that long. But there have been some very important ones.
Well, I was thinking about the Kyoto Agreement and how there are some similarities with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. It's fairly unpopular.
For our viewers and listeners, Kyoto Agreement, the global warming agreement, signed in Kyoto, Japan, with great controversy here and elsewhere about how it's going to work, about what the rich nations have to do in relation to what the developing nations have to do. This is to remind you that you're listening and watching White House Chronicle from Washington, D.C. with myself, Llewellyn King, Linda Gasparello, White House Weekly, Michael Frazier of Howard University, and Jim Bohannon of Westwood Radio. I'd like to say that you can reach Jim Bohannon on the telephone during his broadcast at 1-800-998-JIMBO. And he broadcasts from 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 nights a week. They let him have Saturday and Sunday off. And here he is moonlighting with us, but it's very nice. This program is brought to you in conjunction with Howard University Television and the Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. Enough already of treaties and big bangs. What do you think the big political issues are going to be as we move towards the election? Home alone is not enough of what to describe what the president is doing, Linda. Come along.
Well, no, I mean, who do you want this from the candidate's point of view or from the president's point of view? I mean, as far as the candidates go, I think education is still one of probably the top issue. And I think it's one of the president's, it is certainly on the top of the president's list of wants from the Congress in this session, although I think that many of his education initiatives will probably not pass. Then, of course, there's the drugs issue. Elizabeth Dole keeps bringing it up. And the military. Her issue, of course, is peace through strength. Other candidates bring this up. Safe streets, all of these things along.
Michael, what would you advise the candidates left and the candidates right to do at this point?
Well, I would start with the front runner with the Republican Party and George Bush Jr., who in many quarters people believe he's already got the nomination because he has all this money, is not to do what Nelson Rockefeller did, which was to have all this money, all this goodwill, and he responded miserably because of the kinds of issues that he has focused on. George Bush Jr. is trying to stay in the middle of the political spectrum without going too far to the right, and he doesn't want to go too far from the left. So he is preaching passionate conservatism.
Compassionate conservatism, yes.
Well,
Same thing.
Those are words. I would advise him to choose an issue that he felt very strongly about, like Mr. Forbes, and make that issue the center plank of his campaign. Right now, if you ask the average American people in terms of where he stands on any given issue, they don't know. What they know is he has a very famous name, and he has lots of money, and all the party faithful are gathering to him.
What would you advise Al Gore to do?
To do what he's doing, to go for the juggler. He is in combat, if you will, with Bill Bradley, and Bill Bradley is making some inroads, but what he's doing is calling in all the chips, all the people who owes him because he has supported them in the past. He's asking them to come into the fold now and stand up early to say, I endorse your candidacy.
But Gore's got the problem that you just spoke about in terms of Bush should have a single issue and make that his own and call it his own, call him the education candidate or something. Gore has a very rich plate of issues. It's so complex, actually.
Yeah, that they're self-defeating.
That they are,
I mean,
right. That we don't know who he is and what he's, right.
What are you hearing on the radio in these call-ins night after night?
I hear a great deal of support for George W. Bush. I think we should keep in mind one thing about his campaign. It ain't broke, and I'm not sure he should fix it. Specificity on issues, of course, will automatically alienate a few people, which he doesn't need to do. This man is so independent and so close to the nomination that he has felt free to criticize many of the very people who anointed him the front runner when the Republican leadership, which consists in large measure of Republican congressional leaders, looked at the election results of '98, and this guy cleans house in Texas and picks up huge numbers of women and Hispanics. They virtually gave him the nomination right then and there, and he has turned around now and bitten the hand that fed him and had all kinds of comments about balancing the budget on the backs of the poor. That's how strong he is. He can afford to criticize his core support, and they simply lick their wounds and take it.
I want to know more about talk radio. Why is it that talk radio, which is, I think, a marvelous thing, because people who really could not write to a newspaper or did not write to a newspaper, wouldn't yet publish, really can sound off. But why has it been so successful right of center and so ineffective left of center? I myself have never found more than one or two liberal commentators with talk radio shows and innumerable right of center. Is there a reason for that?
Well, first of all, there is the presence of some major names, Limbaugh, Liddy, people of that ilk. Clearly, automatically bring with them a very devoted following. But beyond that is the fact that a considerable number of conservatives in this country have taken it over the years as an article of faith that the mainstream media are biased against their point of view. Whether you can have supporting evidence for that or not does not alter the fact that their perception is reality to them. And when anybody comes along who preaches their point of view, they flock to that medium. So more conservatives have embraced talk radio and therefore have been a reinforcing mechanism because they simply feel they have no other outlet, whereas I don't think liberals have ever felt that way, really.
Well, and if I may comment, that may be true, but I think ever since the election of President Reagan, the word liberal has been a bad word in the society. And so candidates who have historically been liberal won't say they're liberal. I remember the caucus fiasco when people were asking, are you a liberal? And he wouldn't say, yes, I am. He wouldn't stand up for who I am. And so what that means is that people who are running for public office who may have a liberal platform will call themselves moderate conservatives, whether they really are or not. And therefore, so when you start looking at the media as an instrument that impacts values, it is much more comfortable to say, I am a conservative. I am for traditional values. I am for the right things. And it has permeated throughout the society.
Well, somebody succeeded in demonizing the word liberal. I mean, we live in a liberal democracy. We have liberal market economics at work. Liberal is a very honorable word, and it does not traditionally mean what it has come in its demonized form, largely demonized by right-wing radio and by that very loud part of the political spectrum, to mean something different. It's come to mean, at least in the general parlance, I think, to mean socialist, when it doesn't mean that at all.
Socialist, bloated bureaucracy, yeah, it's come to mean that. Don't forget, too, that a lot of conservatism it follows two very distinct and contradictory points of view, and that is the libertarian versus the social conservatives. And in fact, there are some aspects of social conservatism that embrace big government in terms of
Linda and I
bedroom police
have
and this sort of thing.
evolved a theory, and that is that really we are in the last hurrah of the old politics, and that a new politics will
come along,
appear in the effect of money, personal money, sort of people who think because they can afford it, they will run even if they do not win. We discussed this last time on this program. And I really think we're going to look back on some of these things and wonder that we really had those arguments, because there will be new issues and there will be new players. I think we're in for a sea change in politics.
Are we going to be nostalgic someday for the Warren Beatty, Sybil Shepherd administration?
I am, because I would have so much fun writing about it, and so are you, because you would have so much fun on the radio talking about it every night.
We paid spectators do enjoy this. It's true.
Michael, one of the things you lecture on when you're not lecturing on political science at Howard is international affairs at the Defense University. What do you make of all this? What should we do? We have a hollowed out no military? Do we need to spend a lot more money? Should we be interventionists in the Kosovos, the East Timors, the Somalias of the world? Or should we stay at home and wait for a really serious problem?
Well, it depends on who you ask, but since you asked me, I'll tell you what I think.
That was you I was hoping to hear from.
That's right. Well, you have to give the perspective, because depending on who you ask, you get different kinds of results. I think that the military is being asked to perform tasks that it has traditionally not performed, and there are cost implications that go along with that. I think the entire national security strategy needs to be revisited, and some policy needs to be made as to whether or not you maintain a force that can fight two major wars. If that is the policy determination that we move forward in that same regard, then you have to add additional resources to the budget, considering these other kinds of things, anti-terrorism issues.
The policing issues.
That's right. Bosnia, Kosovo, but there are others. The activity that's taking place in Sierra Leone, where the United States is working diligently with people we have in the past would not want to be in our house, who have committed all kinds of atrocities, but we have decided to bring them together and try to make some kind of a government with them in spite of the fact of how they behaved in the past.
And this has happened traditionally. The British went through this with the dissolution of empire.
Well, the British did a whole lot when they were leaving their empire.
They gave them nice little parliaments.
They sure did.
With a big stick and a wig.
And they drew lines separating some countries from the sea.
They did that a bit earlier on the whole. And now we've got a trouble in the Caprivi Strip, which was a line to try to get one country to the sea. So it's not that easy. But I think what the British did do, of course, these colonial frontiers, which are greatly criticized, but nobody seems to change them. Take the Middle East. Sykes-Picot. Everybody in the Middle East criticizes the Frenchman, the Englishman, Sykes and Picot, who draw the... But nobody, except by war, has changed those boundaries.
No, and
so people live within them.
Well,
as we have a Canadian frontier, which is the product of a war, and we have a Mexican frontier.
Wilson's drawing up.
People criticize frontiers, but tend to live with the ones they've got because there really is no magic way to draw them.
Well, unless you go through military conquest, and then that creates a whole lot of other issues.
Exactly.
Yeah, but the French are a freestanding country. The British have never succeeded in hanging on to France. Isn't that extraordinary? But they've made up for it by drinking nearly all the wine produced in Bordeaux, which they call claret.
Right.
Of course, I can see that Jim Bohannon, great man of the airwaves, is a stranger to these things.
Yes,
because when Linda and I hope Michael are having a nice glass of claret, you are bringing wit and wisdom to the radio listeners of this country.
Or being Irish, perhaps I'm just enjoying a good Guinness. It could happen.
How did you get into political science? Well, what was the attraction of political science?
I met a couple of black scholars when I was a college student, and they said an awful lot about the world. Mac Jones at the University of Atlanta, and Jill Preston, who was the dean of black political sciences across this country, and they were talking to college seniors, and things that they talked about interest me, and they posed a question that I've always thought quite interesting, and I ask my students often the same thing, and that is, why do black people or African Americans support a political regime that has historically worked against their interests, and yet you support it? Why? That's the question they posed to me, and at that time I was perplexed. I wasn't quite sure, because usually Republicans don't support people who operate against their interests. The same will apply with anybody on any part of the political spectrum. So why do black people do this?
And the answer?
And the answer, I was going to say?
You've got us on tenterhooks here. You're not going to let us down, I hope.
Absolutely, because we believe in the myth.
Now, which myth is this?
Well, I'm going to get ready to explain that.
Thank you. Yeah,
sorry.
All right, okay.
And the myth is that there is such thing as a Horatio algae, and the Constitution does provide protection for the people. And that if you're part of the people, you're included in the Constitution, and therefore you have access to opportunities. And so because you believe this, you work towards being successful. At least that's the premise that we talk to our students at Howard University about, and that is to be successful in any and everything that you do. Because I try to train my students to take my job. Because I can't stand there but so long.
Right.
And how did you get into radio, which really does seem rather trivial, but you're going to make a living as well?
Well, compared to that answer, it is very trivial. I wanted to meet girls. The reason I got into radio, which was moderately successful, but along the way I stumbled into a career. And that's the honest truth.
Linda, what drew you to journalism? I mean, you were initially a linguist, an Arabist, and other such things.
Right. I was thinking of going into the Foreign Service, and I decided that life writing reports in the Foreign Service didn't really suit me, and I thought that journalism was a place for me. At least I'd get them published, people would write them, and people would read them, and a good time would be had by all.
Well, I went into journalism because somewhere along the line I realized I wasn't smart enough to be Prime Minister of England. Also, I had never been to England. I was living in Central Africa, and that was another impediment to my ambition.
That would help explain.
And then I dropped out of high school, went to work at the newspaper, and thought, this is a great way to go. And some 43 years later, I haven't changed my mind about that. I love the journalism business. You're listening to White House Chronicle and watching it, coming to you from Washington, D.C. This program is produced in conjunction with Howard University Television and the Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. You can get in touch with us, and we do urge you to do that. We've had some marvelous inquiries on the email. I would suggest you put a telephone number so that I or somebody else can get back to you. Somebody asked me a question about African languages, and to answer it, it would take me 5,000 words, and I'm not going to type 5,000 words, but I would be very happy to explain as much as I know as an answer. We also like to be criticized. We have no problem. We've been called left-wing, we've been called right-wing, we've been called fascist, and we've been called communist. That doesn't mean we're in the middle. It just means that we're a movable feast. So please be in touch. We're really grateful. We've had some wonderful letters and some very critical ones on the email. It's the most efficient way for us to receive them, and we will phone you back and talk to you. We have now reached that point in our program where we have our high points and our low points. And I turn to Linda Gasparello, who has a sort of expectant, what the author Dawnford Yates used to call pregnant expression on her face, so I suspect something fabulous to come forth.
Don't use that word. Anyway, I think there's been so much bickering these days between the Congress and the White House. It's nice to see when they can agree about something, and they did. And that is the hiring of more people with disabilities. The White House has a plan, Congress has legislation, and I think it's about time we get something bipartisan done, and enough of this bickering.
What do you have as a high point or a low point?
Well, the
please,
high
Michael?
point for me is when one of my colleagues, Dr. Elvin Thornton, resigned as president of the school board in Prince George's County.
That, for a benefit of our viewers, is just outside of Washington.
Yes.
In Maryland.
In Maryland.
In Maryland.
In Maryland. The reason it's a high point is now it frees him up to pursue other opportunities which will help enhance the people of the state of Maryland, as well as to help our students at Howard University. To me, that's a high point, given the amount of time that's required to do that job.
Great. And Jim Bohannon.
Well, after calling a news conference and raising many expectations, Warren Beatty did not declare his candidacy for the presidency and has since done little to make us think he will in fact run. That is a real high point to me.
I was hoping that we could investigate his private life and bring juicy details of it.
It'd be a
Apparently,
mini-series, not an investigation.
I think it would be quite an epic series.
Well, Larry Flint's investigating that now.
I don't doubt that.
Flint. I was going to say something nice about journalism. Every decade, or sometimes it's more than a decade, something really innovative happens in my trade. And I want to say that if you want a stunning, extraordinary, unusual, innovative, captivating, annoying, delighting read, try the New York Observer. This is a new journalism with immense, stunning vigor to it, and the great journalists of tomorrow will come out of that paper. Meanwhile, we thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you at the same place on the dial next week. Meanwhile, as they say in my native Africa, Shalagashi means look after yourselves, go slowly.
White House Chronicle, a reverent and sometimes irreverent view of White House and other developments with Llewellyn King, Linda Gasparello, and featured guests, is brought to you by White House Weekly and the Stevens Institute of Technology, Hoboken, New Jersey. White House Chronicle.